In the last segment of the lecture on imperialism, I talked a bit about the war itself, how it played out around the globe, and in a sense, how the United States becomes a world power. After 1898, the role of the United States in the world is changed in that the United States becomes far more of a player than it had been before. Since the Civil War, of course, the United States had been gradually growing in importance, both because of its economy and, as of the 1880s, because of its increasing expenditures on the military. But what's happening in the U.S. in the late 19th century in regard to imperialism isn't just about the United States. It's a process that's involved most of what we call the West, those areas of the globe which are sort of covered by the civilizations of Europe, Western civilization. Secretary of State John Hay referred to the Spanish-American War as a splendid little war. That's a quote. Teddy Roosevelt had said it wasn't much of a war, but it was the only war we had. And I think what both of those imply, if they don't outright say, is that this war, which lasted approximately 3 months, a little over 3 months in terms of actual combat, you might disregard. Perhaps it wasn't all that important. But I think in another, perhaps even more fundamental way than just what happened in a military sense, the Spanish-American War is very important. I think, much like the White City that I began this lecture with, I think the Spanish-American War offers us a chance to assess the United States at a particular time. And through that assessment, gain in reflection a sense of what motivations pushed Americans to do the things they did. William McKinley, President of the United States during the war itself, said this. He said that the United States had a duty, quote, to educate the Filipinos and uplift and Christianize them. Now, I've often thought that's quite the quote when you think about it, because it disregards the whole idea that the Filipinos, the people of the Philippines, had been under Spanish rule, and many of them were Catholic because of their connections with Spain, that history of Catholicism. In making the comment he did, in tying uplift to Christianization, McKinley is suggesting what lies behind, or at least the rationalization he's using to sort of cover over this military or militant expansionism in which the United States is taking part. Remember, out of the war come Guam and Puerto Rico, basic control over Cuba, and actual territorial control of the Philippines. The argument I'd like to make for this lecture broadly, this lecture on imperialism, and the point really that I want to make in this last segment, is less about the United States abroad. It's less about the actual war that will make the United States into a world power. And indeed, it's more about how that war speaks to what's happening here at home domestically for many Americans. You see, the attitudes expressed by John Hay and by Theodore Roosevelt and by William McKinley in regard to the people, in regard to the conquest that's taken place, in regard to imperialism generally, the sentiments that lie behind those events and those actions, I would argue you can see here in the United States domestically. And one of the ways you can see the imprints of these sentiments is in terms of race and ethnicity. You see, part of the question that was generated by what happens with the taking and the control over the Philippines has to do with race. There's a cartoon, and I often use it in my lectures, and it's a cartoon contemporary to the Spanish-American War, and it shows Uncle Sam, and he's behind a garden gate, and he's got the gate open then, and he looks out. He's looking out into the street, and lo and behold, here comes Lady Liberty, and she has a basket, and in the basket is a babe, a newborn baby, and following her are a gaggle of children. And they're of all different races. You have children clearly meant to be seen as of African descent, of Asian descent, Hispanic. And Uncle Sam stands at the gate, sort of scratching his head with his hat, big stovepipe hat, pushed back. Uncle Sam there represents the United States. Lady Liberty, bringing this gaggle of children, represents the sort of unexpected family with which Uncle Sam's confronted. The question Uncle Sam faces is what to do. How do we deal with this issue of race, with these new populations that will now be under U.S. control? When McKinley speaks of the Filipinos as a people in need of uplift and Christianization, what's implied are those very sentiments expressed in that cartoon. He was responding to questions: do we really want to pursue imperialism if it's going to bring into the United States populations, people, races that are seen to be inferior? And McKinley is saying, yes, we do. Yes, we can afford the economic expansion, we can afford the political expansion, we can afford the military expansion, because ultimately our goal is to uplift those inferior peoples who are in need of what we bring, which is civilization. The ideals of America. That's what makes the cartoon so powerful, the one that I mentioned, because Lady Liberty. Think about the notion that you can couch expansion in terms of bringing freedom to people who lack freedom. If that's the case, if I'm right about that, and it's part of an argument, I know, and you don't have to buy it wholeheartedly. You don't have to just take it hook, line, and sinker, as we often say. But I think it's worth thinking about. Because if we turn our attention away from the Philippines and we look back and we think long and hard about the United States during this same period of the 1880s and then into the 1890s, when imperialism is sort of on the move, when America, the United States, is becoming a world power, what we're confronted with throughout the United States is race. What we're confronted with is the imposition of government power on workers. In terms of race, understand that an outgrowth of Southern society in the 1880s and then especially into the 1890s will be the restriction of voting rights for African Americans. Why? Because of race. We refer to that as disfranchisement. And it's during this period, during the late 1880s and into the 1890s, that we see the passage of laws which are designed to keep certain individuals, certain groups away from the polls, away from casting their ballot as is their right under the Constitution and specifically under the 15th Amendment. You may recall in an earlier lecture, I talked about how the Supreme Court had come to read the big three amendments, 13, 14, and 15, that I talked about in that lecture. Well, what begins to happen in the South and the Southern United States as we move into the 1880s and 1890s is that narrow reading of the Constitution and those amendments in particular opens the door for southern state governments to pass these very laws that will disfranchise large numbers of the population. African Americans, poor whites, non-whites. One of the first means for keeping people away from the polls was actually the so-called poll tax. You may be familiar with it. It's simply a tax that one must pay before one can vote. The first of these poll taxes was passed in Georgia in 1877, at the very tail end of Reconstruction. But if you think about the way this tax works, what it ensures is that those least able to afford to pay the tax will be those least likely to vote. If they have to choose between food or voting, there's a far better chance that they'll choose food. In 1890 in the state of Mississippi, we get the Mississippi Plan. At the heart of this Mississippi Plan was something called a literacy test. The way the literacy test worked, and it was used in different forms around the South, but the way this literacy test worked, you could be asked, do I understand, or do you, as a potential voter, do you understand sufficiently when you read something for me to decide that you're capable of voting? And by the me there, I mean a registrar. Somebody that registers you to vote. The problem with a law like a literacy test is the way that it can be maneuvered, the way that it can be manipulated. There's a story, and it may be an apocryphal story. That simply means a story that's got some truth to it, but it may not be entirely true. But it goes like this, and I've sort of heard it for years, but it goes like this. One day, a young African-American male walks into a registrar's office. He wants to register to vote. And he walks up to the counter and he says, "Hey, I'm here to register to vote." The registrar walks up and he used the term that was often used, boy. It's a term that was intended to keep African Americans in the South in their place, which is beneath whites. And he says, the registrar says to the young man, he says, "All right, but before I'm going to register you to vote, I need you to read this passage of the United States Constitution and explain it to my satisfaction." Well, the young man looks at the passage, and it turns out that he's recently graduated from college. In fact, more than graduated from college, he has just obtained a doctoral degree, a terminal degree in political science. He's spent a career so far studying the Constitution and its various meanings and interpretations. And so he explains in great depth and detail how the Constitution, or that portion he's asked to read, how it becomes what it becomes. It should have been an explanation worthy of anyone's approval. And yet this registrar is really not interested in whether the young man is smart enough, whether he's literate, anything else, just the color of his skin. And so he says to this young man, "Yeah, it's pretty good, boy. Now read this." And he pulls the Constitution away and he hands him a newspaper written in Mandarin, in Chinese. He expects there's no way that this young man can read this. The young man looks at it and he says, "Yes, sir, I can read that." He can't really, of course, but he says he can, and he says to the registrar, says right here in this headline, "There'll be one more African American not registering to vote today." Now, the point here is simply this: the laws can be manipulated, but you might be asking, well, how is it that these laws could be passed anyway? I thought the 15th Amendment protected the voting rights of African Americans. And the answer is that narrow interpretation by the Supreme Court. Remember that the 15th Amendment specifically said that no individual, a citizen of the United States, will be denied their right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Understand that a literacy test doesn't measure any of those things technically. You see how sort of sneaky that is? So the law says, the Constitution of the United States says, I can't deny you the vote based on race or whether or not you were a slave. But it doesn't say anything about whether or not you can read to my satisfaction. And once that door is open, there are multitudes of ways that I can keep people from voting just because I don't think they should vote. Similarly, we have in the South the so-called grandfather clause. Remember, the 15th Amendment had said race, color, previous condition of servitude. In other words, I can't be denied the vote because I was a slave once. But with the court's tacit permission, state governments are able to say, we're not denying you the vote because you were a slave. Instead, we're going to look at the status of your ancestors. We're going to look at whether or not they voted and base opportunities to vote not upon whether you were in servitude, but whether you could, during or prior to the Civil War, actually vote. In other words, we're limiting your ability to vote to whether you earlier, during or before the war, or your ancestors voted, thereby allowing us to get around the restrictions. And all because of the court's sort of narrow reading of the 15th Amendment.